Afternoon. Thank you for asking me to speak at your conference. I'm just going to share my screen and I'm going to be talking about risk factors for cognitive decline. My name is Gill Livingston. I work at University College London, and I'm going to talk to you about hearing loss and cognitive decline and dementia. So the work that I've done and which I'm going to talk to you about today has been part of, in the main, 2 Lancet commissions on dementia prevention, intervention and care, one published in 2017 and one published in 2020. And this work was done not just by myself, but by a large number of other co-authors who you see, some of them around this table as we discuss dementia intervention and dementia prevention. What I'm going to talk about now is what dementia is and how it might be prevented, because I don't think everyone here's main interest is in dementia. I'm going to discuss something about individual risk factors, but mainly about hearing and the concept of population attributable fraction, how much of dementia could be prevented, and what we think future action should be. So dementia, I'm going to talk first of all about dementia prevalence and age. We all know that we're living in a time where thankfully we have an aging population as more and more people survive childhood and midlife. And as the age is very much related to dementia prevalence, that means dementia prevalence is expected to increase. And that's exactly what has been happening. There's a global increase in the number of people with dementia. That's expected to rise from about 50 million now to about 132 million by 2050. And that has important consequences for individuals who, as dementia is often the most dreaded disease, for their families who have to look after them, and for the economy as people have to be looked after and families give up work and require support themselves. It's particularly important now in low and middle income countries, as that the number of people with dementia is particularly increasing in them, but it's also very important in high income countries. While the overall number of people with dementia is increasing in every country, in some countries the incidence, that's a number of people per 100,000 with dementia, is decreasing. For example, United States, United Kingdom, France, Holland and Sweden, suggesting that dementia is potentially preventable, but the number of people with dementia is stable. A number of people per 100,000 with dementia is stable or increasing in some countries, for example, Japan, South Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, India and Brazil, suggesting that it's not inevitable that the rate of dementia decreases and that it really makes a great deal of difference what we do. So this is a review in 2017 showing some countries where dementia has decreased, and that's been updated in 2020, publication in Neurology, which suggests that in a number of high-income countries, the prevalence of dementia, not the number of people which has increased, but the prevalence per 100,000 of older population has decreased by 12.5% over each of the last 2 decades. So there's been a decrease of 25%, which is completely amazing, and suggests that if we had a drug that could do the same, we would really be using it, and that we ought to think very carefully about how to do this everywhere in the world and how we can make things better. So how does this work? It works because in general, that if you look at this slide, you'll see that on the bottom left-hand corner, this is the amount of neuropathology changes in their brain related to performance. And the more neuropathology you have on average, the more likely you are to have a cognitive decline and then develop dementia. If you look at the 4 graphs above this, you'll see that there's a huge change. So there's a huge difference as to what difference it makes. So in the top graph, you'll see that some people with high cognitive performance have quite a lot of neuropathology, and right on the right-hand side of the top graph on the left-hand side, it's really people with quite a lot of neuropathology, and yet and they don't have any impact in their cognition at all. And there are some people in the bottom graph on the right who have a late dementia and actually have less neuropathology than some of the people on the left. So the idea of this, there is cognitive reserve. Some people have enough reserve in their brain that although they have neuropathology, they can continue to function well cognitively. And it's thought to be made up of three different substances, three different ways. One of them is physical, so the neurons in your brain. However, if you have more neurons and synapses, you have more reserve. The second one is brain maintenance, the genetics or the lifestyle, which makes a difference. And the third one is adaptability, which enables people to function despite neuropathology. And these things are not static and change through life. And as the number of neurons probably only changes until the end of childhood or the beginning of adulthood, it really makes a difference what people do early in life, and other things make a difference about what people do late. And that leads to our important message that it's never too early and it's never too late in life to think about preventing dementia. So the first Lancet Commission in 2017 on dementia did the first life course analysis. We defined midlife as age 45 to 65 and later life as more than 65. And this was the first analysis to include your area of interest, which is hearing. And because there hadn't been any systematic reviews and meta-analysis of the effect of hearing loss on dementia, we decided to do a systematic review and meta-analysis, which we hope to supersede soon. And at that point, we could only find 3 papers which we defined as high-quality papers. They had to have follow-up more than 5 years to show that it wasn't that the dementia was causing hearing loss. The hearing loss precedes dementia. They had to have an objective measure of peripheral hearing, and the outcome had to be incident dementia adjusted for age and cardiovascular risk. There's 3 papers, as I said, one of them by Frank Lynn, who's also talking in this part of the conference. And they showed, as you can see here in the graph, all of them, that having hearing loss, and in fact, the earliest one was 12 years before, so 12 years, it was 12 to 17 years before, decreased the chance of people having dementia. And that was increased the chance, and the increase was nearly twice as much. And here we have just the systematic review. So we had a systematic review, and from this, we wanted to consider the population attributable fraction of dementia and what of hearing loss for dementia. And what population attributable fraction is, the fraction theoretically prevented by eliminating a risk factor. And that depends on the relative risk, how big is the risk of that risk factor, times the prevalence of the risk factor. And we used all-cause rather than Alzheimer's disease dementia international data when available. We also considered commonality, and here we have the equation for commonality, and I'm not expecting you to try and calculate it, but I think I want you to understand the point is that people are not like lab rats. People tend to have clusters of risk factors, and we wanted to adjust for them. So the individual who has obesity is more likely to have diabetes, is more likely to be physically inactive, and more likely to have high blood pressure. So we input data on all the risk factors to generate a correlation matrix and consider the commonality, and to adjust down for the fact that people may have more than one risk factor. And so we managed to generate a population attributable fraction for the 12 risk factors. I'm not really going to talk very much about the other 11, which you're not really interested, but looking at hearing loss, you can see that the relative risk for anyone with hearing loss developing dementia is 1.9. So people are nearly twice as likely to develop dementia. And hearing loss is really important, is really common. So because of that, it means that people are very likely to, it means it has a big effect on the population. And the unweighted population fraction was 22. But because we considered what other risk factors other people had and the commonality, we weighted it down, and the overall risk factor was 8.2, and this still meant it was the biggest risk factor of any of the 12 risk factors that we considered. And again, I'm showing that hearing loss is very prevalent, and partly depends how you define it, but by the time people are aged over 75, it really becomes more important, more common than any other illness, and throughout it's much more common than dementia. This infographic is our population attributable fraction infographic, and it shows the life course. And in early life, education is very important, but still not as important as hearing loss. In midlife, there are hearing loss, traumatic brain injury, high blood pressure, alcohol, and obesity. And in late life, smoking, depression, social isolation, physical inactivity, air pollution, and diabetes. And you can see that of these 12 risk factors, that hearing loss might contribute to others. So people who have hearing loss are more likely to isolate themselves socially and more likely to become depressed. So people have discussed why might hearing loss be a risk factor, and whether peripheral and central hearing loss are different. And you can see here that the discussion suggests that central hearing loss is to do with the auditory cortex, and it's much rarer than peripheral hearing loss, and is much higher risk for people developing dementia at a short time and follow-up, and is thought to actually be probably related to people. It's not different from dementia, it's probably quite similar, that people who have difficulty with their central auditory pathway have difficulty with their central cortical activity. And it's likely to be prodromal dementia. And you can contrast that with peripheral hearing loss, which, while it's high prevalence, much higher than central hearing loss, has a lower relative risk for dementia. It takes longer for people to develop dementia, and it seems much less likely to be a prodroma for dementia. And people who have age-related hearing loss are helped by cochlear. Peripheral hearing loss are helped by amplification. People with central hearing loss are not really helped. Whistle for that. So since we published this in 2017 using other people's research, we have other people have begun to look at the effect of hearing aids. And very interestingly, one big study of nearly 4,000 people with self-reported hearing problems found that dementia incidence increased 25 years later, except in those using hearing aids. Another study of people with hearing loss found that those people who were not using hearing aids had a much higher rate of reduction in cognition. And a nationally representative study of over 2,000 people who test for every 2 years found that once people started to use hearing aids, that was a big protection from cognitive decline. And their rate, as soon as they started to use them, their rate of cognitive decline decreased. Equally, people have looked at other mechanisms. What is it that's actually happening? And find that hearing loss associated with increased temporal lobe volume loss, increased hippocampal volume loss. And these are the areas of the brain which are associated with memory. People have tried to think how this might work and suggested that hearing loss leads, as I said, to social isolation, which leads to depression, and also, and hearing aid use helps it, but also that hearing loss is related to cognitive loss. And hearing is related to keeping cognition as your brain is stimulated. And this is a hypothesis of the path to dementia, that hearing aids intervene at the point where hearing loss leads to distorted auditory input, difficulty in understanding speech, and all of the different effects. So reduced communication, social isolation, depression, exhaustion, less cognitive resources for other tasks, brain atrophy, and difficulty navigating. So people have asked me in an earlier webinar I did today about the cost and how countries can afford it, especially low-income countries. I wanted to share with you a paper which came out in Lancet Healthy Aging last week, which was led by Nahid McAdam, this is her picture here, and which I'm the senior author. It's also got many authors, both from Public Health England, from Sergio Costa Frida, who does lots of work on hearing, and from people in London School of Economics who did the costing. What we did is we did a systematic review of interventions for individuals which had been shown in randomized controlled trials to reduce dementia, not to reduce depression, sorry, interventions to reduce the risk factors for dementia, and with robust evidence and are feasible. And we found that midlife hearing loss, we'll be unsurprised to know, is one of these. We calculate, we use a societal perspective, what it costs for health, social and family care. And we, when people developed, we considered the cost of the intervention, the annual incidence in people with the risk factor, the reduction in incidence of the risk factors controlled, the annual cost of dementia per person, and the cost in the population of people living longer. And what we found 4 interventions which worked well for individuals, and for hearing loss, if we took 3 kilohertz as the threshold, we found that hearing loss, treating it with a hearing aid, saved £607 per annum in people compared to by preventing them developing dementia. So treatment and provision of hearing loss reduces cost because people developing dementia increases cost. So it's not what you can afford, it's how you can afford not to treat. So I'm telling you all of this. I'm hoping that you will understand and take it to your own localities and countries and begin to think about treating hearing loss, not just for individuals to help them in everyday function, which is very important, but to consider reducing dementia. The purpose of healthcare and policy is to change things, to make things better for people, and that's probably why all of us have come to these professions. So this is a picture of UCL where I work, and with leaves blowing over in the autumn wind. And I wanted to thank you all for your attention and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.